So for generations, the U.S. was seen as the beacon of democracy, the model that other countries would emulate. And as you just heard on the last panel, the U.S. would very much like to continue playing that role. President Biden would. But there are clearly efforts both from within and without to undermine American democracy. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and the U.S. role in global leadership. Previous Copenhagen Democracy Summits have hosted bipartisan congressional delegations. Members of both U.S. political parties have participated. We were unable to find a Republican to join us this year. However, we are pleased to have with us, virtually from Washington, Senator Mark Warner, a Democrat of Virginia. Senator, it's so nice to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Jeanne, and it's glad to be with you. First of all, say I do think there will be Republicans who want to participate. There's a lot of bipartisan interest on this subject. And I'd also want to thank Anders and his efforts. I remember sitting with him probably 5 or 6 years ago when he first laid out this vision as I was working on the Intelligence Committee in our bipartisan effort at looking at Russian intervention, not only in America, but in democracies around the world. So I'm glad this summit is part of the outgrowth of those activities.
Senator, the U.S. was glued last night to the first hearings of the January 6th committee. Does the very fact that January 6th occurred demonstrate that U.S. democracy is in jeopardy?
Well, it demonstrates that something happened on January 6th, and I was on the floor of the Senate that day when those insurrectionists took over the United States Capitol that I never thought would happen in my lifetime. This was the kind of occurrence as an American, you read about in other nations, but you didn't think would take place in America. I am disappointed, particularly on the House Representative side, that many of the House Republicans have embraced Donald Trump's big lie. I can tell you on the Senate side, the vast majority of the Republicans I work with, regardless of what they may say publicly, but privately acknowledge what a travesty that was. And I think the January 6th committee, we are still laying that out in full public. I think it will, and I hope it will, convince Americans that that tragedy cannot and must not be repeated. I think we've still got enormous challenges on how we maintain democracy. My background was a technology guy, and there are some great things coming from technology, but the deep, dark underbelly of social media has been how Trump's big lie or other levels of misinformation, disinformation, anti-democratic tendencies are promoted all around the world. So we've got things to do, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk about some of those things in terms of technology reform. But clearly, democracy is not only under assault in America, but right-wing populism exists, unfortunately, throughout the world at this point.
So we have seen not only January 6th, but efforts to undermine voting rights in some places. We have seen election officials harassed. How would you assess the health of American democracy?
I would give it a need for improvement. I'm not sure I'll give it a letter grade.
Oh, be brave, Senator. Come on.
I just because it's I can argue. I'm clearly concerned about some of the efforts in states across the country. Again, promulgated by Trump's notion that somehow elections are insecure in America. I would point out that Donald Trump's own top official, Chris Krebs, who is head of the effort to evaluate elections, said the 2020 election was the fairest in our history. And we have seen in states like Georgia and elsewhere certain restrictions placed on voting rights. On the other hand, we just saw a primary in Georgia where we had the highest voter turnout, even with these new laws, that new law in place. So I think people in our country are anxious to express their views. I do think there are the kind of non-factual based policy pronouncements that some people make concern the heck out of me. I do think we will, on a structural basis, I'd like to see a greater focus on voting rights. But I still think America serves as that beacon of democracy. And frankly, it is still the country where people across the world literally will do anything to be part of our society. And I think the one thing I want to just take a moment, is that clearly the last few years, January 6th, some of the dysfunction where I work, COVID has raised a host of questions about whether the question about liberal democracy that this conference is about, the notion of a free press, right to vote, the right to agree and disagree, whether that can stand the test of time against authoritarian regimes like Russia or China. But the thing that has given me the most hope, and I think, frankly, a lot of folks that I work with, is the courage of the Ukrainian people, where they are literally voting with their lives to say the system that you in America and the West take for granted each day, we will give our lives to have part of that system. And I hope for all of us in this conference that it kind of removes some of the moral ambiguity about who the good guys are. We need improvements in our system, absolutely, but we should never doubt that this democratic system that we enjoy in America and in the West and countries, particularly across Europe, is a system worth fighting for, worth defending, and worth promoting.
I promise I'm only going to ask one more question about U.S. domestic politics, but there is a lot of talk of civil war on opinion pages and academic fora. Do you think that's a real possibility in the United States of America?
No, I don't. I think that if you look back, in periods in American history, the 1890s, some of the challenges in terms of post-World War I, the rise of folks on the left, the Depression, challenges as this country started in the 50s to deal with racial disparities, a process that still is ongoing, challenges in the 1960s where young people across the country in America and in the West took to the streets. I think some of these comments about the breakdown of civil society and a civil war, they may be attracting eyeballs, but I don't think they are where the vast majority of the American people are. Thank God.
So as promised, I will now switch to the global point of view, but with a little American twist here.
That's fine.
Do you think that the U.S. still has the credibility to lead a global alliance of democracies?
Respectfully, and I say this to so many of my European and other colleagues who are in the room, when we didn't have that American leadership during the 4 years of Donald Trump, when he tried to whether take us out of NATO or refuse to step up in terms of dealing in an organized way with the rise of China. And when I say China, I think it's really important, not just from a messaging political correctness standpoint, but to make clear our beef, my beef at least, is with the Communist Party of China, Xi Jinping's leadership. It is not anti-Chinese or anti-China diaspora around the world. Failure to do that plays into the CCP's agenda. But when America tried to withdraw during the 4 years of the Trump administration, I feel the rest of the world was a little bit aimless. I think when you think about the conflict in Ukraine, it was once again, and let's take NATO. NATO was broken and adrift post-Trump. A resurgent America under President Biden, led candidly, I say, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, by an American intelligence community that got it right about what Putin and Russia were planning to do. I remember being at the Munich Security Conference, and many of our colleagues, even some of our Ukrainian friends, still didn't believe this was going to happen. But the fact that then America has led $53 billion now of total military and economic aid combined in reaffirming NATO, Sweden and Finland joining, I think American leadership is absolutely essential. Arguably, if we move to Afghanistan, the exit there was less than well run out. Although, if you take for a moment the fact that even with the tragedy at the airport of that brutal bombing, if you would have asked me before Afghanistan, how would we feel if we'd been able to evacuate 125,000 Afghans to a new life either in Europe or America, that was beyond even what our expectations were there. So I do think America, with all its flaws, remains that essential democracy. We need to do better, but I still think it is a country that without this leadership, the rest of the world tends to wander a bit.
You've referenced Ukraine. Do you believe that the U.S. and the rest of the world's democracies are doing enough to support Ukraine?
Well, again, if you recall prior to the war, there was a question about how NATO would respond. There was a question whether our German friends would be willing to take on and get rid of things like Nord Stream 2, whether the West would rise to the occasion. Again, I think we have met that call. NATO is more united than ever. The fact that Sweden and Finland want to join, the fact that our friends in Switzerland have actually, for the first time historically, come off their traditional neutral position. Now, part of that was obviously generated by the brutality of Putin's invasion and the atrocities committed by his forces. Could we have gotten some of our arms sooner? The bid and the ask between what the Ukrainians are asking for and what they're getting, we're probably lagging a few weeks. That's not just though America, that is our European allies as well. But if you take for a moment the $53 billion that America has committed, and roughly it's about 60-40 military to other type of aid, and you look at a rough analysis of our European allies, together we are totaling close to $50 billion in defensive aid committed to Ukraine since the beginning of the year. You take that $50 billion number and peg it against the total Russian defense budget of $66 billion. That is not giving the Ukrainians parity, but we do need to get particularly these longer range artillery and other tools to the Ukrainians. But the Ukrainian military has the runway so that Putin knows, even with his kind of slogging it out in the east, the Ukrainians will have the armaments need to continue to resist literally for months to come.
So does the West need to do more?
Can the West speed up delivery of the next iteration of weapons? Yes, we need to continue to move. But I think whether it is in Europe, and I think even this is my understanding, even more heartfelt in Europe than in the United States, there is great backing of the Ukrainians to push the Russians out. But I don't believe that backing extends to Ukrainian forces striking into Russia. And some of the equipment that is being provided now has that potential as well. I will say one other item here that I think there is a big open question. I say this as somebody who was a technology guy before I got into politics. The dog that hasn't barked yet, or fully barked, is the Russian cyber capacity. We've seen Russian military, we overestimate it, and I think most of us agree on that. The Russian cyber capacity, if we go back and look at the NotPetya attack, if we look at SolarWinds, we know they have that capacity. I think our defense has gotten better, and I think that's not just governmental defense, but private sector partners like Microsoft. But I am still very, very concerned that we in the West, and I frankly think it may be a massive Russian cyber attack would be probably more geared, less against America and more against some of our European partners. That is something that I still think we need to do a better job on. And I hope that one of the outcomes of this conflict will be, as we hopefully get to a conversation about Alliance of Democracies, that we try to set some level of international cyber norms, which we are sadly lacking at this point.
Is there any hope for that?
So, in a way, I have to acknowledge when the rest of the world wanted cyber norms back in the late 90s, it was the United States that resisted those norms. So, we have to be on a perspective basis. But I think one of the areas where we're talking about the military collaboration against Ukraine, but I frankly think we need to do increased trade. I'm strongly in favor of additional American natural gas exploitation and trade in terms of providing LNG to make sure that we've got skin in the game as we ask our European friends to get off Russian gas supplies. But an area that is, I believe, in calling out for international democratic collaboration is cybersecurity norms. I think, and Secretary General Rasmussen many of the things that he started this whole initiative was around disinformation, misinformation, that gets into the title of social media, privacy and data. Again, our European friends have taken more of a leadership here. But across these domains, I think there is hope for collaboration. And then the area that I am particularly most focused on, because while Russia remains a military threat, it's not an economic threat, and that is the enormous economic and technological challenge that China presents. And my belief is, partly because we've seen what Putin has done, partly because I think some of the naivete about Chinese Communist Party's practices of intellectual property theft or creating a Orwellian surveillance state in China with their tech companies has, I think, generated the notion that we need an alliance of democracies around technology development. I think the West got caught off guard by the rise of China around 5G and Huawei. I think we need a technology alliance not only around things like telecom, 5G, O-RAN, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, synthetic biology. And one area where you've already seen the West, not just America, but candidly some of our European friends have moved faster than we have in America, and that is around semiconductors. We are seeing China move from single-digit numbers to about a third of the semiconductor production. Semiconductors are in literally every device that has an on and off switch. We are about 11 months behind on legislation that I got through the Senate on making a $52 billion investment. Many of our European friends have stepped up even quicker than America. But this is the kind of collaboration around technology development that I think ought to be the model of the future.
It's obviously not just a governmental project. It's a technology business project. As someone who comes out of that sector, do you believe that the industry is ready to step up and play the role that it needs to?
Well, I do. I believe they will. Let me focus for a moment more on China and, again, how China has created this Orwellian surveillance, society where they see the power of their great Chinese tech companies, frankly, working hand in glove with the Communist Party. I think, I started a number of years back trying to brief in a classified setting, industry after industry, about this emerging challenge. Pre-COVID, there was some pushback. From academia, there was pushback. Private equity, frankly, wouldn't even meet on a bipartisan basis with us about this threat because they were making too much money in Chinese tech companies. Post-COVID, there is, I think, a real acknowledgement from the private sector that turning a blind eye to $500 billion of intellectual property theft or the Chinese government's atrocious behavior towards the Uyghurs or the people of Hong Kong. I think large business enterprises, not just in America, but across the West, realize China's playing in a authoritarian capitalism game where they allow competition at a startup level, but then have national champions that frankly are not playing fair on any level. I do think business is willing and anxious to partner. And I do think, while I'm still a market-driven guy, there will be areas of domains where the West writ large, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's next generation, 5G, 6G, O-RAN, whether it's artificial intelligence, quantum computing, that we, the West, needs to maintain technological dominance. Part of that, and this gets a little nerdy, but it's important, is that it also means we need to collaborate on setting the rules, protocols, and standards of these new technologies, because that is, again, a way your values are represented.
Many of the participants here in Copenhagen have portrayed the world as in an existential fight, democracy versus autocracy. Do you see the world that way? And what role do you believe that an alliance of democracies could play?
Unfortunately, I do feel that this is that conflict of authoritarianism versus democracies. And I think we've seen now the level of, what is the terminology that Putin and Xi use, friendship that knows no bounds. And, and candidly, again, I think the economic model that China presents is much more attractive than the Russian model. But the idea that China, through its Belt and Road Initiative, can say, we have an authoritarian state and we will offer you not only investments in your traditional infrastructure, but we can provide you, if you're an authoritarian leader, with their surveillance system where you can monitor any dissident in your country. I can see that could be an attractive model. So I do think democracies need to stand up. I frankly wish the administration, and I've had this debate with the administration a number of times, that this needs to be more formalized rather than a one-off set of allies on semiconductors, another on telecom, a third on artificial intelligence. There might be different countries that would play different roles. I think this needs to be broader than the kind of traditional American approach of either Five Eyes or NATO or even Quad. I think it very much needs to include some of our Asian allies. We've seen already, countries like Japan, South Korea, others stand up on Ukraine. I've been disappointed on some of our friends like India and Israel not fully weighing in. But if we think about this technology alliance, it is a much broader set of players than the traditional American-based alliances that have existed in the past. And I think there would be that interest, because I do think the challenge of the 21st century, candidly, will not be who has the most tanks, guns, and planes, but I think it'll be who leads the development in these technology domains. And I think, candidly, we in the West, post the fall of the Soviet Union, assumed that we would dominate in all these areas. Perhaps America the worst, thinking they would not dominate in all these areas. And China has a very, very aggressive policy that I think we need to counter.
Senator Mark Warner, thank you so much for joining us from Washington. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeanne. I know I'm the one with President Obama, and I think they'll all be, as always, very impressed by your presentation. Thank you, Jeanne. My best to all.
Thank you.